start reading at verse 25. And this is within Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And this particular section, he's teaching about worry. Anybody here worry? Just me? There's a few of us in the crowd, isn't there? There's a few of us that worry. Well, Jesus is talking about worry here, and he says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more important than food, and the body more important than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the lilies of the field grow? They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and gone tomorrow, is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them." Now this is the key verse. This is the one that we have to pay attention to. "But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." Indeed, each day has enough trouble. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. This morning we're looking at the topic of committed to the person of Christ. And in particular, we're looking at overall worship. And as we worship, sometimes we think of it just being here. Sunday morning, 10:30 to 11:30 or so, that's when we worship. But you know, each and every day we worship. We worship as we breathe. We worship as we spend time with him in prayer, as we read his word, as we spend time with other people, and we love other people. We are loving our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so we are committed to the person of Christ. Now, Larry was telling us about a hockey game, but I know baseball season has already started. But what happens before baseball season starts? There's usually what? Spring training. It's an annual event that all professional ball players have. And I think I have a nice picture there of the Toronto Blue Jays. Hey, Larry, go Blue Jays. What? Yeah. These guys make millions of dollars for working about 8 or 9 months a year. But before the season begins, they go south to Florida. They go, I was looking at a map yesterday of Florida and where all of the baseball teams practice through it. They don't all practice on the same field. They have all kinds of fields all over that state. They go to the baseball park, they get ready for the baseball season. What's really interesting is that spring training is critical to the success of the team. What they do in spring training is that they try to get themselves back into physical shape. They try to get themselves emotionally prepared and focused. And they go back and they try to teach them the basics over again. How to bunt, how to steal a base, how to think through a play, what to do in a position. Because for some reason, baseball players lose their edge in the off-season. Once they've been out of the circuit for the winter, they forget the basics of baseball. Right now, here in Norton, we're in spring training. We're not going to get on a bus and go to Florida, sorry to say. We're not going to throw balls all over the place. But through this series of sermons that we've been looking at this spring, we're springing into action. We're coming together to get ourselves refocused on the basics of being the church in today's world. I'm convinced that churches can lose sight of their reason for existence and its importance. And so every once in a while, it's good to come alongside and say, here's what it's all about. And so we're in spring training this spring in Norton, seeking to spring into action for Christ. And so over the last number of weeks, we've been looking at the basics. We've been refocusing on what they are. And the first week, we looked at contributing to the work of Christ. We looked at ministry, being involved in what Christ would want us to do day by day, seeking to be involved in what He is up to, contributing to His work. The second week, we looked at the fact of continuing to grow in the grace and knowledge of Christ, to be a disciple, to come alongside Christ, to learn from Him, and to see how He acted, how He reacted, how grace just came from Him to people who He should not have been graceful to. A leper approached Him, and what did He do? He ended up touching him. A lady at the well comes to draw water, and what does He do? He talks to her and shares with her love and grace. Last week, Noah looked at fellowship, about being connected to the body of Christ, and learning about being connected to each other, working with each other, and helping each other. Grant, I'm going to get you to do one thing for me. There's a thermostat right behind you. I'm going to get you to just tweak it up to about 15 or 20. We're running low on oil, so we're trying to conserve, but it's getting a little cool in here, don't you think? Yeah, so we'll bring it back up to heat. Anyway, so this week, we're moving on. We're going to be taking a look at being committed to the person of Christ through worship. And the question that comes to my mind when I think of being committed is, what are we committed to? When we think of the statement, committed to the person of Christ, I wonder, what are we committed to these days? So first and foremost, we'll look this morning at what are we committed to? What are the things that are most important to us? I shared with the kids, like part of the, being a kid, what are the most important things? Well, they're toys. I was kind of overprotective of my toys when I was a kid, which sometimes I still am. But I had Star Wars action figures. And out in our backyard, we had this rock wall that was down at the bottom of the hill. And I was playing with my action figures out there one day, and I ended up losing this guy, his name is Bosk, into the wall. Bosk is still there because he's plastic. He's not going to break down because I couldn't get to him. I'm not taking apart the rock wall, but there he is in the wall. And what happened to me? Well, I was so beside myself that I had lost this action figure. What did my mom do? You tell me. What? She got me another one, that's right. She bought me a new Bosk. I could actually go next door and get him out of storage if you want me to and show you. Because Mom told me one day when I was home, please take your toys. That was back when Benjamin was a little guy, and he started playing with them as well. But what are we committed to? What are the things that are important to us? If you ask Jesus what should be important, He would say what? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's right. Those are the most important things. But when we look at our own lives, is that so? When what we will give our time to, there are things that we need to give our time to. Our obligations, like work. We need to eat each day. We need to, clean ourselves. We need to provide for our families and so on. But what do we give our free time to? To show that, to the show that we just can't miss maybe. And if we're away, we're going to set the PVR to tape it. so that we can watch it later on. Maybe it's playing a favorite sport. Maybe it's having fun with your family. And of course, one of the things that should be what? Seek ye first is Christ and following Him. Our time should be what we give our time to. Part of that should be to Christ. But there are all kinds of things that we can give our time to, but they're not all of equal value or importance. What else do we commit ourselves to? Well, what we give our money to will show what we're committed to. Again, there are things that we need to give our money towards. We need to pay our bills. If we don't, somebody's going to come and get us. We need to buy groceries. We need to go to the grocery store and buy food. And I would say that we need to give a tenth of what we earn to God as well. But what do we spend our extra money on? What are those things? What are we committed to? What will we invest our talents in? The question, what are we committed to, really can be rephrased this way. What is most important in your life? And I would say that what we spend our time, our money, and our treasure on will show what we really find important. I love what it says in Mark chapter 12. In the New Living Translation, it says this. It says, one of the teachers of the law was standing there listening to the debate. He realized that Jesus had answered well, so he asked, of all the commandments, which is the most important? And Jesus replied, the most important commandment is this. Listen, O Israel. The Lord our God is the one and only Lord. And you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and all of your strength. The second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. Think about that. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart. That's not just your emotions, but that's loving Him with everything that you are. And that kind of goes along with soul as well. Our heart and our soul, well, two very different aspects of our own bodies. Our soul is that which God has breathed into us, that we give to Him. To love Him with all of your mind. It's not only what you say, but what you think as well. And all of your strength, everything that you do. It's loving Him. And loving your neighbor as yourself. I remember hearing the story of commitment. And it was a father and a son. And the father was kind of skeptical of his teenage son's newfound determination to build some big muscles. And so one day they were at the store, and the teenage son was in, it was the sporting goods store, and they came to the weight department. You know, the weightlifting, the barbells, the dumbbells, the benches, and all the rest of that stuff. And they were there admiring the weights, and the son asked the father, "Oh, Dad, please, can you get me one of these weight sets? I want to get big. I want to get like Arnold. I promise I'll use them every day," he said to his father. "I'll use them every day." And the father said to him, "Well, I don't know, Michael. It's a really big commitment on your part to commit yourself to doing that every day." Please, Dad, went on. He says, they're not cheap either, you know. That's quite an investment that we need to make. I don't want to just buy it and then, you know, sell it in a yard sale where I won't get my return back. You know, you need to commit yourself. "Oh, I'll use them, Dad, I promise. You'll see. And in a month I'll be even bigger, and then in a year I'll be pushing you around, Dad." Well, finally, he won over his dad. The father paid for the equipment, headed for the door, and after a few steps, he heard his son say behind him, "What? You mean I have to carry them to the car?" Commitment means work. When we're committed to something, it means that we work on it. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, it says, "So let us not allow ourselves to get fatigued doing good. At the right time, we will harvest a good crop if we don't give up or quit. Right now, therefore, every time we get the chance, let us work for the benefit of all, starting with the people closest to us in the community of faith." Sometimes when we think about, our neighbor, we think of maybe somebody in Africa. Maybe we think of somebody that's in a different province. But we need to start right where we're at, in our neighborhood. Loving those who are right beside us. Being committed to Christ, being committed to the person of Christ, means loving those who are right there. The people closest to us in the community of faith. That's where we begin. The second thing that I want to look at this morning is that phrase, committed to the person of Christ. You see, Jesus said it well in Matthew 6:33 that we read earlier. "Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you." You see, to seek first his kingdom and righteousness means to turn to God first. First for help, to fill our thoughts with his desires, to take his character as our pattern, to serve and to obey him in everything. And that's a big one, to take his character, Christ's character, as our pattern. When he was on the cross, what was it that he said to those who were standing around? He said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." That's part of the character of Christ. He offered forgiveness even though it wasn't deserved. He offered grace. He offered love. That's part of the character of the pattern that we seek to serve, that we seek to obey. But what is really important to you? Is it people or objects or goals or other desires? They all compete for priority. Any of these can quickly bump God out of first place if we don't actively choose to give him the first place in every area of our lives. A friend of mine was pastoring a church in Caledonia and Kempt, which is very close to Kejimkujik National Park, if you know Nova Scotia at all. And he had this old, beat-up, broken-down car. And he was always doing work on it. And so he asked God to help provide for him a vehicle that he could use for ministry. And he said, "It's yours. It's not my car, it's your car." And Glenn proved that over and over again. Somebody called him up and needed to borrow a car. "Sure, take it. It's not my car anyway." I remember when he went back home to British Columbia. I was working at Long Lake Camp at the time, and he said, "Do you need an extra car?" He said, I don't need it while I'm in British Columbia. I'm not driving there. I'm going to fly. So here are the keys. Here's the car. Use it as you see fit. He wasn't committed to his stuff. The things that he had were God's. And he said, "Lord, use it whichever way you want to use it." And so he gave those things away. Giving him first place is being committed to the person of Christ. Being committed to him. And I see that there are really at least 3 different ways of being committed to Christ. The first one, I would say, is being committed to being like Christ. In 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1 in the New Living Bible, it says this. It says, "You should imitate me just as I imitate Christ." Now, this is Paul that's speaking. In the New International Version, it puts it this way: follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Paul wasn't being arrogant. He did not think of himself as being sinless. He didn't think of himself as being Christ. He was a disciple of Christ. At this time, we need to realize that the Gospels were not written. The way that people knew about Christ was from what people were telling them, the stories that were shared of Christ's life. And so Paul wasn't being arrogant. He was saying to the Corinthian people that, look at how I live for Christ and imitate me. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. You see, there are people all around us that need a Christ-like example to follow and to point them to Jesus. And whether you realize it or not, people are watching you as you follow. People are watching you to see what you do, to see what you believe, and what you say matches up to your day-to-day. You see, the long and the short of it is that people want to see Jesus, and they are wanting to see him in you. Or are they seeing too much of you? When I was a leader at camp, one of the things I would always say to my counselors, I would say, you may be the only Bible that one of these campers will ever read. You may be the only Bible that one of these campers will ever read. And that isn't just at camp, I would tell them. That means that when you leave camp and you see them in the mall, that you're the same in the mall as you are at camp. One of the things that broke my heart one day was a counselor. I heard the story of a counselor from Bayside that was in the mall. He saw one of his campers, and the camper was so excited to see him because it was one of his favorite counselors. Came up to him, and the counselor looked at him and he said, I had to be nice to you at camp, but I don't have to be nice to you now. Get away from me. Think about how you could break a heart like that. That's not being Christ-like in any way, shape, or form. You might be the only Bible that someone else will ever read. We need to be committed to being like Christ. But we also need to be committed to living life with Christ. Because how can we be like Christ? We need to be like Christ by being with Christ. In Ephesians 5, 1 and 2, it says, imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. See, just as children imitate their parents, and sometimes we don't want to imitate our parents, but then our parents are just coming out of our mouths every time we turn around. But we should imitate Christ as we imitate those who are around us. His great love for us led him to sacrifice himself so that we might live. You see, our love for others should be of the same kind. A love that goes beyond affection to self-sacrificing service. Living with Christ is to live like Christ. To live like him. And the third thing I see there of being committed to living for the person of Christ is to be living for Christ. In Romans 8:29, in the New King James, it says, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. You see, we're living for him each and every day. I love the way that Eugene Peterson wrote this passage in the Message. He said this, he said, God knew what he was doing from the very beginning. He decided from the outset to shape the lives of those who loved him along the same lines as the life of his Son. The Son stands first in the line of humanity he restored. We see the original and intended shape of our lives there in him. After God made that decision of what his children should be like, he followed it up by calling people by name. After he called them by name, he set them on a solid basis with himself. And then, after getting them established, he stayed with them to the end, gloriously completing what he had begun. You see, living for Christ is seeing in Jesus the intended shape of our lives and giving it all to him every day. This is loving the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. It's a life of worship. Because as we are committed to the person of Christ, and as we live for him, as we live like him, as we live with him, that's worship. That's worship. There are lots of boys and girls who worship people in this world. They want to be like them. They want to live like them. They seek to talk like them, to dress like them, to be like them. But Christ calls us to worship him, to worship God, Father, Son, and Spirit, to be committed to the person of Christ. And how do we live that out? How do we live out this commitment day by day? How do we do this day by day by day? Eugene Peterson, again in the Message, put it this way in Matthew 28, said that Jesus, undeterred, went right ahead and gave his charge. God authorized and commanded me to commission you. Go out and train everyone you meet, far and near, in the way of life, marking them by baptism in the threefold name, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Then instruct them in the practice of all I have commanded you. I'll be with you as you do this day after day after day, right up to the end of the age. Living like Jesus is going out and living for Jesus in the way that he lived. Living for Jesus is going out with Jesus, for he is with us as we live for him day after day after day, right up to the end of the age. And how do we do that? It's in the decisions that we make each day. It's in the decisions that we make. If we're talking with somebody and they start sharing with us about something that they're going through, do we say, well, I don't have the time for you right now, I gotta keep going, gotta go. Or do we pause and take the opportunity to be there for that person at that moment? That's being like Christ. He was in position a lot. He's walking down the road and some guy comes up to him and says, my daughter is dying. I need your help right now. So what does he do? He starts going towards their house. The servant comes, she's dead. Don't bother the master anymore. Don't worry, he said. Let's go. And he brings her back to life. Inconvenienced, but yet served. It's day after day. It's in the decisions that we make. A fellow by the name of David Gibson, he shares this. He says, my friend's father was an army sergeant, and he tried for 25 years to quit smoking. After multiple failed attempts, he went in for his yearly medical exam with an army doctor. And the physician told him that his health was being severely harmed by smoking. and that he should stop. The sergeant confessed that he had tried to stop before, and there was